Hello, welcome to the class. The first lecture is going to make reference to the article by Shireen Razak, Gendering Disposability. My name is Tara Atluri, and I will be your professor for the semester. I hope you enjoy the lecture and the class. Thank you. I should also give a trigger warning. I am going to discuss the murder of Cindy Gladue, which is a case of murder and that happened in Edmonton, and it will involve graphic descriptions of sexual and physical violence. And so if you feel uncomfortable with this, please feel free to stop the video and you can read the article on your own. You can also look at next week's articles as well. Thank you. So the lecture will discuss missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. In 2011, 36-year-old Cindy Gladue, a Cree woman, bled to death in an Edmonton hotel room. Bradley Barton, a white man who worked as a trucker, had purchased her sexual services on at least two occasions, including the night she died. In 2015, Barton was tried for the murder of Cindy Gladue. The defense maintained that Cindy had bled to death from a tear that occurred during an episode of consensual rough sex when Barton inserted his fists into her vagina. The Crown argued that the 11-centimeter wound had been caused by a knife used by Barton. In a bid to demonstrate its theory about the knife, and on the advice of the senior pathologist in the case, the Crown introduced as evidence Cindy Gladue's vagina, tissue apparently severed from the rest of her body. The judge permitted the severed part of the pelvic area to be viewed on a screen, behind which the pathologist testified as he pointed to the actual tissue. Barton was acquitted of all charges, and the case is on appeal. So, Shireen Razek's article draws on Giorgio Agamben's writing regarding homo sacer. And homo sacer is a concept that Agamben uses to discuss disposability. So, in Agamben's writing, Giorgio Agamben draws on the example of the king. And the king, as a sovereign power, can put people to death. With impunity. And so, without any penalty or without any reference to modern law or due process, a king can sentence someone to death. And so Agamben is interested in the ways that modern nation states still produce this figure of the homo sacer who can be killed or turned into what Agamben refers to as bare life. And so Shireen Razak is interested in asking whether Agamben's work uh, could be used to understand the plight of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls who are often killed without any real recourse to law and who are often killed in ways that exonerate uh, murderers and specifically white men. So the Supreme Court of Canada finally did put Bradley Barton in jail. So he is serving a 12 and a half year sentence for manslaughter. However, the earlier trials involved an obscene amount of racism and sexism towards Gladue. So these photos of Cindy Gladue smoking and other photos of her consuming alcohol ran in the press during the first trials of Bradley Barton. In the first trials of Bradley Barton, before the case went to the Supreme Court, Cindy Gladue was referred to as, quote, a native girl and, quote, a native prostitute over 50 times in a court of law. Bradley Barton was never referred to as a white man or as a white trucker or a white settler. Um, these photos obviously conjure up images of substance abuse, addiction, that is specifically imagined to be more acute or problematic in the lives of Indigenous people than in the lives of settlers due to Canadian racism. So, Canadian racism often operates by magnifying any kind of, I guess, problems or negative things that Indigenous people do and that other people of color or Black Canadians do. So this is how racism and discrimination often operates. So discrimination often involves an obsessive focus on any negative behavior or uh, appearance-based commentary, mistakes, imperfections in people whom you have decided are inferior. So if you decide already that a group of people is in fact inferior, you will then collect evidence to prove your theory. And this is how colonial research often operated, that the concept of race and racial hierarchy dates back to colonial rule. So early colonial explorers often collected evidence to prove the inferiority of people of color, thereby justifying enslavement and theft of land, and forced schooling and forced Christianization. So when one wants to kind of lie and cheat and steal and rape and kill, they can come up with a theory and then they can collect evidence to justify this theory. It's a lot like doing business. I mean, if, for example, as we'll discuss, if someone wants to build a golf course in Canada, they will often come up with a whole series of justifications for why certain land is rightfully theirs and it does not belong to Canada's Indigenous peoples. And so obviously the truth of these claims or these truth claims are made to justify economic gain. So this is a clip about the trials of Bradley Park.
We have breaking news out of Edmonton. Bradley Barton has been sentenced to 12 and a half years for killing Cindy Gladue, an Indigenous mother of three. Gladue was found dead in an Edmonton hotel room a decade ago, and Barton, a former truck driver. We have breaking news out of Edmonton. Bradley Barton has been sentenced to 12 and a half years for killing Cindy Gladue, an Indigenous mother of three. Gladue was found dead in an Edmonton hotel room a decade.
Sorry, for some reason the screen share keeps pausing. I don't know why. Try once again.
We have breaking news out of Edmonton. Bradley Barton has been sentenced to 12 and a half years for killing Cindy Gladue, an Indigenous mother of three. Gladue was found dead in an Edmonton hotel room a decade ago, and Barton, a former truck driver, was found guilty of manslaughter in February. A warning to our viewers that this story contains details which may be disturbing. The CBC's Paige Parsons is in Edmonton, and she was listening to the sentencing. Paige, what can you tell us about what the judge had to say?
Well, in the moment before he delivered that sentence, he told Bradley Barton that there was simply an intolerable level of blameworthiness in this case. And he ultimately sentenced him to 12 and a half years. And with time already served, it'll be about 11 years and 200 days that Barton has left to serve. Now, this was for a manslaughter conviction in the death of a young mother, Cindy Gladue, who died back in 2011. It followed basically what the judge described today as an injury caused by a sexual assault. She bled to death in Barton's hotel room at the time. And so the sentence he landed on is about the midpoint between what the defense and Crown prosecutors were seeking, but he said it came down to aggravating factors, such as that Barton, didn't try to get Gladue help. He didn't tell the truth when he was speaking to police and others after the incident. And that's how they arrived at that sentence of, over 12 years.
Now, this case has been going on for over a decade. This was actually the second time that Barton has been tried in the death of Cindy Gladue. What has happened since then?
The original trial, he went to trial on a murder charge back in 2015, and he was acquitted initially. But that sparked, large protests in Alberta here and elsewhere because of the way that Cindy Gladue was spoken about during the trial. They relied on some, myths and stereotypes about Indigenous women as well as sex workers. She was because Gladue had participated in a cash transaction for sex with Barton, but ultimately that went up through the appeal court in Alberta to the Supreme Court of Canada, and they ended up retrying him for manslaughter here today. And so it's been a really long journey. It's been very hard on her family, who in their victim impact statements during this trial shared just what a nightmare it's been for this to go on for decades, and how much they really miss Cindy. So the family had said previous to the sentencing that they were hoping that after today, they'd be able to get some closure.
All right. Thank you so much, Paige. That's the CBC's Paige Parsons in Edmonton. And if you need support and would like to talk to a counselor, you can call an independent toll-free line. That number is 1-844-413-6649. It is available free of charge, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
So, Alberta's Court of Appeal heard arguments that a former Ontario truck driver should be tried for a third time in 2011 in the death of Cindy Gladue, in the case of Cindy Gladue, or the case of Bradley Barton, who murdered Cindy Gladue. Barton, 54, was sentenced to 12 and a half years for manslaughter. And I'll discuss 4 ideas. Firstly, Cindy Gladue and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Then I'll discuss criminal law, denunciation, and deterrence. Then I'll discuss eugenics and biopolitics. And finally, I'll finish by discussing the politics of visual representation. So the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report is a report that was released by the federal government of Canada. And it documents what some authors have termed genocide. And the specific aggression and animosity and, in certain instances, hatred of Indigenous peoples is expressed in the desire to kill Indigenous women and girls, or to forcibly sterilize Indigenous women and girls, thereby enacting a genocide that is perhaps similar to Nazism. So, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls refers to the national crisis in Canada and the US involving disproportionate violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit LGBTQI plus people stemming from systemic human rights violations, colonialism, systemic racism. The report, launched in 2016, investigated this crisis, finding these violations at root causes and issuing calls for justice in its 2019 Reclaiming Power in Place report, leading to the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Two-Spirit Plus National Action Plan to address these issues. So in 2016, this report was released by the federal government of Canada, and there was a lot of news, and it followed the TRC report, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. So since that time, as a Canadian and as an academic, who has a PhD in sociology from York University, and my postdoc is from the Open University. And both of my postdoc and PhD were fully funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, which is a federal funding body. So from the time that these reports have been released, I have witnessed an extreme form of backlash within the university community and within all of Canada's institutions, specifically hiring men, and men who have been convicted or accused of sexual harassment, domestic violence, even the killing of women in other countries, and bringing them to Canada and giving them high salaries has been something that I have been a witness towards and been disgusted by. Supporting men who have sexually harassed students and actually criminalizing students who report the sexual harassment, the rape, the stalking, and filing charges of defamation against students in Canada has happened since the release of these reports. There has been a great deal of anger on the part of the Canadian public and a defense of men. Uh, there's been a defense of, firstly, white Canadian settler men, men who have attacked transgender women, men who have attacked women of color, men who have killed their wives, men who have sexually harassed students, men who have tried to kill their gay and lesbian and transgender children. And these men have been defended in Canada's institutions, in all institutions. They've been defended in the private sector. They've been given promotions. Then we come to what happens now and later on, that men who actually uphold values that would be against international law and propagate religious fundamentalism and extreme forms of orthodox religious violence against women have had a platform within the university. So even after the killing of Massa Amini, the universities and Canada's institutions have promoted men who actually support religious violence against women and forced marriage, and who do not support queer rights under the guise of multiculturalism or some form of anti-racism, which I guess involves supporting someone's right to be a pathological criminal, a rapist, and a murderer as a form of, yes, quote, anti-racism. And so this has happened in Canada, and I believe it has been a direct result of these two reports and of the mobilization of Indigenous women and Indigenous people and allies of Indigenous peoples. And I believe that this backlash will continue and will cause many people to quit their jobs. It will also cause a lot of lawsuits and a lot of legal claims. So the case of Cindy Gladue was one case in which a white man who did murder an Indigenous woman was finally put in jail after Supreme Court trials. So as I mentioned, during the first trial, the judge and lawyers referred to Cindy as a prostitute or sex worker over 50 times. And she was referred to as a quote, native prostitute or quote, native girl. So the language harkens back to a different time in Canadian history when people did not use terms like Indigenous. So much like high profile cases where university professors like Jordan Peterson say, I mean, girls and boys, and old language does not correspond with our modern law. These cases obviously are indicative of a lack of respect for Canadian law and a lack of respect for modern business terms, modern language. So language is one of the ways that sexual violence, racial violence is kind of managed. So using terms like native girl is a way of diminishing the harm that one has caused against a person whom they have actually killed. It's a way of diminishing the person's life and the integrity of their human life. This kind of localized Canadian English, a native girl, also does not make reference to the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls report, which quotes many scholars who have referred to Canadians as being people who are actively propagating genocide. And the term genocide has been debated, but it is one that scholars have used over and over again to look at the ways in which many of the tactics used by Nazis against Jewish people and against other minorities during the Holocaust have been used to kill Canada's Indigenous people, including forced sterilization of Indigenous women and girls, including impoverishment, the theft of land, cartoonish images in the media. Um, all of these kind of Nazi-like tactics have been used and continue to be used against Canada's Indigenous people by Canadian settlers. Over generations, the use of brown people uh, and successful Asians and South Asians and successful middle-class people of color has also been used as a tactic against Canada's Indigenous people to try to tell a story of Canada as some sort of multicultural utopia, while all of these tactics, like the burning of fallopian tubes by nurses in the Canadian healthcare system, the theft of Indigenous people's lands, the theft of their property, and the killing of Indigenous women as a form of amusement and enjoyment continues to happen as Canada uh, elects Asian mayors or gay Black police. So, Catherine Morton has published this book chapter, Ugliness as Colonial Violence, Mediations of Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women in the Politics of Ugliness, edited by Sarah Rodriguez and Ella Prisbolo. And so, what Morton is arguing is that the media's representation of Indigenous women and girls as addicts or as poor, and the photos that are used of mug shots and the really unflattering images, often of Indigenous people being drunk or often of Indigenous people sleeping on the street, engaged in crime, this kind of really hideous or ghastly media production of images. Is a way that the violence is normalized. It is also a way that the media participates in posthumous trials. So posthumous trials are what happens when, or are, it is a process in which the criminal justice system victimizes someone after they are dead. So a good example is George Floyd. So George Floyd, citizen of the United States of America, uh, was referred to as having, quote, counterfeit currency over and over and over again after he was dead. So Derek Chauvin, a white American police officer, stood on George Floyd's neck and he screamed out, "I can't breathe," 20 times. And then he, of course, died. But in the trial of Derek Chauvin, George Floyd was referred to as someone who had, quote, counterfeit currency. So even after someone is dead, they can be then put on trial. So their murder seems like it was a valiant kind of killing of a criminal by a hero, rather than the killing of an innocent civilian who was unarmed or who was not, I guess, accused of any crimes of murder themselves and who should not have been killed, and who was not actually given a fair trial if they were, in fact, a criminal. So these kind of posthumous trials are really disturbing, but they aren't really new in the criminal justice system. So putting women on trial who have reported rape because of their clothing or consumption of alcohol or because of their mental health, because of their lifestyle, or even because of their personality, is common. And there's a long history of it in the criminal justice system everywhere in the world. So rape victims are also often portrayed through this discourse of the ugly or the fallen woman, the awful woman, the nasty woman who in fact deserved to be raped. And these trials of provocation have a long history in the American and Canadian criminal justice system. So Shireen Razak cites the work of Francois Vergas. The fabrication of disposable peoples throughout history points to the permanence of a specific construction of otherness in which the excess of enjoyment is expressed through the transformation of a human being into matter. And Razak cites Francois Vergas, who discusses the ways that colonialism often involved turning human beings into disposable matter or into human waste. What I would argue is that class is central to the case of Cindy Gladue and to the murder of Cindy Gladue. The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. The class, which is the ruling material force of society, is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. The class, which has the means of material production at its disposal, has control at the same time over the means of mental production, so that thereby, generally speaking, the ideas of those who lack the means of mental production are subject to it. The ruling ideas are nothing more than the ideal expression of the dominant material relationships. The dominant material relationships grasped as ideas, hence of the relationships which make the one class the ruling one, therefore the ideas of its dominance. The individuals composing the ruling class possess, among other things, consciousness, and therefore think. And so far, therefore, as they rule as a class and determine the extent and compass of an epoch, it is self-evident that they do this in its whole range, hence, among other things, rule also as thinkers, as producers of ideas. So for Marx, this idea of the ruling class is about the control over the mind and the control over ideas. So there is base, which is our everyday life. We all work, we all labor. I would argue that the law is really part of the base structure that Karl Marx is describing. So at the base, there is the written word, the law. There is the obvious examples of the police, CCTV cameras, but the superstructure is really about ideas. Who controls our minds? Who controls our ideas and hence ideology? So for Marx, capitalist ideology is what we do, but we do not know we are doing it. We are all participating silently and seamlessly and without a great deal of effort in capitalism. So for Marx, we are all kind of in many ways duped by capitalist ideology. So the fact that Cindy Gladue appears to us as being bad in some way or negative is part of the ruling ideology and the way that ruling settlers, and specifically white settlers, and middle class settlers, middle class cisgender heterosexual suburban settlers, have control over our ideas and whom we think of as what Sunira Tabani would refer to as an exalted subject, as opposed to those who we think of as lesser than. And when those who are lesser than die in this kind of white settler nation building and in this kind of class hierarchy, their deaths are not honored or remembered or even taken seriously. So, for instance, writes Marx, in an age and in a country where royal power, aristocracy, and bourgeoisie are contending for mastery, and where therefore mastery is shared, the doctrine of the separation of powers proves to be the dominant idea and is expressed as an eternal law. So this kind of aristocracy and the example of the aristocracy takes us back to Homo Sacer, because Giorgio Agamben really does believe that there are traces of this kind of feudal lordship even in the modern nation state. How does a refugee just die on a border? Who makes this decision? Who, who makes this choice or decision? Who is in a power to let live or let die? And it is the state. But then who is the Homo Sacer? And in many cases, it is not a white affluent person who is let die, but the person who is let live and the person who has the power to decide who lives and who dies is obviously the most privileged person and someone who occupies the position of the ruling class. So Marx is also interested, obviously, in the division of labor. So Karl Marx writes, the division of labor, which we already saw above as one of the chief forces of history up till now, manifests itself also in the ruling class as the division of mental and material labor, so that inside this class, one part appears as the thinkers of the class, its active, conceptive ideologists, who make the perfecting of the illusion of the class about itself their chief source of livelihood, while the other's attitude to these ideas and illusions is more passive and receptive, because they're in reality the active members of the class and have less time to make up illusions and ideas about themselves. And so, if we were to think about this division of labor, we can turn to the scholarship of Marxist feminists like Nancy Fraser, who looks at the ways that bodily labor, domestic labor, the labor of giving birth to children, the labor of the body is often thought to be women's work. And so obviously the mental labor, intellectual labor, philosophers, great painters painting a dot and making a million with a dot on a canvas is the work of great men. And we can see this in contemporary US politics. The Vice President of the United States of America believes that women are cat ladies and sociopaths who, because they do not do the work of childbirth and child rearing, which is essentially bodily labor. And so intellectual labor is not seen to be valuable when it is done by women. It is somehow sociopathic behavior. So in reality, when sociopaths kill women, they often reduce women to a body part. So Bradley Barton inserted a knife into Cindy Gladew's vagina, and she bled to death in a hotel bathtub. And this is obviously an effort to reduce women to their bodies. In the first trials of Bradley Barton, a white trucker and a white man, Cindy Gladue was then referred to as, quote, a native prostitute, quote, a native girl, over 50 times. This girlhood is about infantilization. She was not seen to have intellectual capacity of an adult. So she was, yes, a girl. And then a prostitute, which is again about her body. There is no reference to Cindy Gladue's education. Cindy Gladue could have had a PhD from York University, as I do. Cindy Gladue could have had a postdoc, as I do. Cindy Gladue was a mother. Cindy Gladue probably worked at some point. She was 38 years old and born in Canada. So this effort to reduce Cindy Gladue to matter is an example of her reduction to bare life, someone who can be killed with impunity in the way that an aristocrat could kill a slave. Yasmin Jawani comments that Indigenous women are largely portrayed as abject victims of poverty, their lives marked by alcohol and drug addictions, homelessness, high infant mortality and morbidity rates, greater incidence of HIV, hepatitis infections, and gynecological cancers. In effect, they are represented as one of the most hopeless segments of society. There is a common treatment within the visual discourse of missing and murdered Indigenous women that establishes Indigenous women as the most helpless and vulnerable marginalized population. Anderson and Robertson comment that through the visual discourse, the press tells stories of violence against Indigenous women by constructing them as weak, backward, sexualized objects, anonymous, replaceable bodies. So this kind of disposability is also about the division of labor, the base, the superstructure, and the class structure. So those who produce high-minded ideas, the ruling class, those who can think, those who can feel, those whose relationships and legal contracts and legal rights are seen to have sanctity, the exalted subjects, are deserving of sympathy. They are people whose names we remember. There are people whose titles we remember, whose labor we value, whose ideas we value. They did exist. They do and did exist, and they will exist in history. Those who can be killed, like Cindy Gladue, with a great deal of hatred and vengeance, and then with mockery in the media, with mockery in courts, are forgotten, and they are forgotten in history. This is really also about history and who records Canadian history. So colonial history begins at the point when a white, blue-eyed, blonde-haired man, a white Christian or Catholic man, a European man, sees others. And so before that, there is no history. And history is often buried because history is often recorded as only beginning at the point of colonial contact. And obviously, there are radical or more progressive historians in this time period who would look at history before colonial contact. But a lot of history is still thought of as beginning with a colonial gaze. And so this is also how Indigenous people become disposable. Albert Memmi, a post-colonial scholar, argues that colonized people bear the mark of the plural, which means that when you are a colonized person, you are not an individual. You can be grouped together en masse as an African or as a person of color or as a Indigenous person. You are not given any rational individual personhood or agency. This is also about the law. So individuals have legal rights. The law confers rights onto individuals. As an individual person, I have one name, one bank account. I am an individual. I have one mind and I can make rational choices with my mind. But if I am then put as if I am then made to or forced to exist as part of a group, I cannot think for myself. I cannot make choices for myself. Other people can speak on my behalf. And the feminist movement has documented the ways in which women are often subject to this kind of paternalism. Women are not thought to be people who can make rational choices. So women who are part of certain ethnic or religious groups are often spoken about and for. They are often discriminated against, or we are often discriminated against as people who belong or are property of some sort of ethnic or religious group. This happens at all levels of institutions in Canada, including immigration, the banking sector, the workforce. So being thought of as the wife or daughter of an ethnic man or a man who practices a religion is a way that one does not have full legal rights or human rights and is therefore disposable, nameless, a person with no history. So the second point I'll discuss is criminal law, denunciation, and deterrence. And I'll stop the lecture now. I'll record the second half in a different video. Thank you.